become perhaps his most famous address, the 7th of March speech. Webster sought to rally his colleagues to adopt the Compromise of 1850, a package of legislation that he and others hoped would forestall a civil war brewing over the question of slavery. He said, "It is fortunate that there is a Senate of the United States, body not yet moved from its propriety, not lost to a just sense of its own dignity and its own. But I hope he was not wrong to put his faith in the Senate, because the design of the Constitution and the intention of the other body would be likely to feel confidence enough in its own situation to preserve, unawed and uninfluenced, the necessary impartiality between an individual accused and the representatives of the people, his accusers." In the same essay, Hamilton explained this about impeachment. "The subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may, with peculiar propriety, be dominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. The prosecution of them, for this reason, will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community, and to divide it into parties more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. In such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt." Daniel Webster and Alexander Hamilton placed their hopes in you, the Senate, to be the court of greatest impartiality, to be a neutral representative of the people in determining, uninfluenced by party. Today you have a duty to perform with fidelity, not without a sense of surrounding dangers, but also not without hope, to impeach or convict a president. Impeachment is an extraordinary remedy, a tool only to be used in rare instances of grave misconduct. But it is in the Constitution for a reason. In America, no one is above the law, even those elected President of the United States. And I would say, especially those elected President of the United States. You've heard arguments from the President's counsel that impeachment would overturn the results of the 2016 election. You have heard that in seeking the removal and disqualification of the President, the House is seeking to interfere in the next election. Senators, neither is true. And these arguments demonstrate a deeply misguided, or I think intentional effort to mislead about the role that impeachment plays in our democracy. If you believe, as we do, and as we have proven, that the President's efforts to use his official powers to cheat in the 2020 election, jeopardize our national security, and are antithetical to our democratic tradition, then you must come to no other conclusion that the President threatens the fairness of the next election and risks putting foreign interference between the voters and their ballots. Professor Dershowitz and the other counselors to the President have argued that if the President thinks that something is in his interest, then it is by definition in the interest of the American people. We have said throughout this process that we cannot and should not leave our common sense at the door. The logical conclusion this argument is that the President is the state, that his interests are the nation's interests, that his will is necessarily ours. You and I and the American people know otherwise. But we do not have to be constitutional scholars to understand that this is a position deeply at odds with our Constitution and our democracy. That believing in this argument or allowing the President to get away with misconduct based on this extreme view would render him above the law. But we know that this cannot be true. What you her ability to repair her faults.
Mr. Chief Justice and Senators, over the past 2 weeks, the House has presented to you overwhelming and unconverted evidence that President Trump has committed grave abuses of power that harmed our national security and were intended to defraud our elections. President Trump abused the extraordinary powers he alone holds as President of the United States to coerce an ally to interfere in our upcoming presidential election for the benefit of his own re-election. He then used those unique powers to wage an unprecedented campaign to obstruct Congress and cover up his wrongdoing. As the president's scheme to corrupt our election progressed over several months, it became, as one witness described, more insidious. The president and his agents wielded the powers of the presidency and the full weight of the U.S. government to increase pressure on Ukraine's new president to coerce him to announce 2 sham investigations that would smear his potential election opponent and raise his political standing. By early September of last year, the president's pressure campaign appeared on the verge of succeeding. Until that is, the president got caught and the scheme was exposed. In response, President Trump ordered a massive cover-up, unprecedented in American history. He tried to conceal the facts from Congress, using every tool and legal window dressing he could to block evidence and muzzle witnesses. He tried to prevent the public from learning how he placed himself above country. And yet, even as President Trump has orchestrated this cover-up and obstructed Congress's impeachment inquiry, he remains unapologetic, unrestrained, and intent on continuing his sham to defraud our elections. As I stand here today, delivering the House's closing argument, President Trump's constitutional crimes, his crimes against the American people and the nation, remain in progress. As you make your final determination on the president's guilt, it is therefore worth revisiting the totality of the president's misconduct. Doing so lays bare the ongoing threat President Trump poses to our democratic system of government, both to our upcoming election that some suggest should be the arbiter of the president's misconduct, and to the Constitution itself that we all swore to support and defend. Donald Trump was the central player in the corrupt scheme, assisted principally by his private attorney, Rudy Giuliani. Early in 2019, Giuliani conspired with 2 corrupt former Ukrainian prosecutors to fabricate and promote phony investigations of wrongdoing by former Vice President Joe Biden, as well as the Russian propaganda that it was Ukraine, not Russia, that hacked the DNC in 2016. In the course of their presentation to you, the President's Counsel have made several remarkable admissions that affirm core elements of this scheme, including specifically about Giuliani's role and representation of the president. The President's Counsel has conceded that Giuliani sought to convince Ukraine to investigate the Bidens and alleged Ukraine election interference on behalf of his client, the president, and that the president's focus on these sham investigations was significantly informed by Giuliani, whose views the president adopted. Compounding this damning admission, the President's Counsel has also conceded that Giuliani was not conducting foreign policy on behalf of the president. They have confirmed that in pursuing these 2 investigations, Giuliani was working solely in the president's private, personal interest. And the president's personal interest is now clear: to cheat in the next election. As Giuliani would later admit, for the president's scheme to succeed, He first needed to remove the American ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, an anti-corruption champion Giuliani viewed as an obstacle who, and I quote, was going to make the investigations difficult for everybody. Working with now indicted associates Lev Parnas and Igor Fruman, Giuliani orchestrated a bogus, months-long smear campaign against the ambassador that culminated in her removal in April. The president's sudden order to remove our ambassador came just 3 days after Ukraine's presidential election in late April, which saw a reformer, Volodymyr Zelensky, swept into office on an anti-corruption platform. President Trump called to congratulate Zelensky right after his victory. He invited President Zelensky to the White House and agreed to send Vice President Pence to his inauguration. But 3 weeks later, after Rudy Giuliani was denied a meeting with President Zelensky, President Trump abruptly ordered Vice President Pence to cancel his trip. Instead, a lower-level delegation led by 3 of President Trump's political appointees, Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, Ambassador to the European Union Gordon Sondland, and Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations Kurt Volker, attended Zelensky's inauguration the following week. These 3 returned from Ukraine impressed with President Zelensky. In a meeting shortly thereafter with President Trump in the Oval Office, they relayed their positive impression of the new Ukrainian president and encouraged President Trump to schedule the White House meeting he promised in his first call. But President Trump reacted negatively. He railed that Ukraine tried to take me down in 2016. And in order to schedule a White House visit for President Zelensky, President Trump told the delegation that they would have to, and I quote, talk to Rudy. It is worth pausing here to consider the importance of this meeting in late May. This is the moment that President Trump successfully hijacked the tools of our government to serve his corrupt personal interests. When the president's domestic political errand, as one witness famously described it, began to overtake and subordinate U.S. foreign policy and national security interests. By this point in the scheme, Rudy Giuliani was advocating very publicly for Ukraine to pursue the 2 sham investigations. But his request to meet with President Zelensky was rebuffed by the new Ukrainian president. According to reports about Ambassador Bolton's account, soon to be available, if not to this body, then to bookstores near you. The president also unsuccessfully tried to get Bolton to call the new Ukrainian president to ensure he would meet with Giuliani. The desire for Ukraine to announce these phony investigations was for a clear and corrupt reason, because President Trump wanted the political benefit of a foreign country announcing that it would investigate his rival. That is how we know, without a doubt, that the object of the president's scheme was to benefit his re-election campaign. In other words, to cheat in the next election. Ukraine resisted announcing the investigations throughout June, so the president and his agent, Rudy Giuliani, turned up the pressure, this time by yielding the power of the United States government. In mid-June, the Department of Defense publicly announced that it would be releasing $250 million of military assistance to Ukraine. Almost immediately after seeing this, the president quietly ordered a freeze on the assistance to Ukraine. None of the 17 witnesses in our investigation were provided with a credible reason for the hold when it was implemented, and all relevant agencies opposed the freeze. In July, Giuliani and the president's opponents appointees made clear to Ukraine that a meeting at the White House would only be scheduled if Ukraine announced the sham investigations. According to a July 19 email, the White House has tried to suppress this drug deal, as Ambassador Bolton called it, was well known among the president's most senior officials, including his chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, and Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo. And it was relayed directly to senior Ukrainian officials by Gordon Sondland on July 10 at the White House. Everyone was in the loop. Although President Zelensky explained that he did not want to be a pawn in Washington politics, President Trump did not care. In fact, on July 25, before President Trump spoke to President Zelensky, President Trump personally conveyed the terms of this quid pro quo to Gordon Sondland, who then relayed the message to Ukraine's president. Later that morning, during the now infamous phone call